Hello, everybody. Welcome to the groups chapter, part one. So we need to talk about some groups stuff. We've discussed some group things before, but this is going to be a little bit different because we're going to talk about some more specific topics. But the first thing we need to do is kind of identify what do we mean when we mean groups. So I want you to tell me, how many people does it take to be a group? Okay, so normally, in psychology, when we're talking about this, you realize that one person by themselves is probably not a group. Two people, is that a group? Well, generally in psychology, we call that a dyad. D-Y-A-D, a dyad. That's two people together, like a couple, like as a dyad. But after we get about three people and up, that's when we can create a group. So you have to have at least three people. But even then, some people think that three is, kind of low for a group. But at least three. One is an individual, two is a dyad, three can at least start to be a group. When we talk about groups, what do we really mean? So when you think of the word group, go ahead and define it for me. When we talk about groups, we're going to define it as people bonded together in a coherent unit. Now, that's not a very good definition. I get it. I know. Bonded together in a coherent unit. What does that even mean? So first of all, they have to be, it has to be clear that they're a unit, right? That they are organized as one thing, okay? And they have to be bonded together in some way. So the reason why we're talking about this is we need to figure out, like, what do we mean by coherent? What makes a coherent bonded unit? What does that really mean? We need to talk about the idea of entitativity. So in this case, how entitativity means how much of an entity are you, right? An entity. How much of a unit, how much of a group, how much of an entity are you? So low entitativity would mean that there's not a lot of coherence involved here, right? We don't perceive ourselves as being a unit, a coherent unit. So for example, if you just happen to be at the bus stop with, let's say, 6 other people, are you a group? Well, maybe it's a group of people waiting for the bus. You might say that. But you don't really see yourself as a coherent group, right? You don't have any identity with those people. You don't really care about them. You just happen to be with them for the same purpose. Compare that to a group that has high entitativity, like your family, right? We see ourselves as a group. We identify as our group membership. We are very much an entity. That is what we're talking about in entitativity. So it has to be enough entitativity that you see yourself as a unit, or at least that other people would, in order for the group to be a real group. So let's talk about how groups function. Now we're going to talk about a few things that are important aspects of how groups interact with each other and the rest of the world. So the first thing is norms. We've talked about norms before, but groups create norms. Now, norms are not like laws, but they're understood rules of how you act. They don't have to be written down, but they're just understood as that's what we do. So for example, in the United States, when people greet each other, they're probably more likely to shake hands or give a hug as compared to kiss each other on the cheek. If you are in a place like Portugal, for example, and you meet someone, generally somebody of the opposite sex, and that person is a friend, then you are generally expected to kiss them on the cheeks. Now, there's no law that says you have to, but it's just understood. That's what you do. It's a norm. There are lots of different norms. Some that you understand, some that you don't. Some that you realize, and some that you just kind of grew up in, so you assume that that's the way everything works. But norms are an important part of how groups function. So are roles. Inside of the group, different people have different roles. So for example, if we're talking about my family as a group, then my wife has a role that's slightly different than my role, which is different than my children's role, right? We have different functions. We have different functions that we are intended to do and roles that we take inside that group. In groups, there's often status, higher status and lower status. That means that certain group members tend to be perceived as just higher rank in general than the other group members happen to be. So For example, in the Army, if you are in an Army unit, then you know that there's a specific rank, right, that indicates the status. But it doesn't have to be that clear. You might have a group of friends where it's clear that one person really has a higher status. They're like the leader, right? They're understood to be the group leader, even though there's no like voting or there's no actual rank that people are given. It's understood who the higher and lower status people happen to be. Now, cohesiveness gets us close to that idea of entitativity, right? But this is like the closeness. Entitativity just means, do we see ourselves as an entity, right? The cohesiveness is how close we actually are, the factors that would want us to keep in a group. Cohesion, sticking together. That's what we're talking about here. So how much you like each other, the status that they give you, the identity that you have with them, the effort that you've put into them, ideas of competition, specifically competition against other people, and the group size can all be factors of how cohesive you happen to be. So for example, you probably have some sort of an identity as a student at your university, right? But that's generally a rather large group size, and so that's a little less cohesive perhaps than your family might be, right? So those kind of things will affect how groups function. Now, through the rest of this, we are going to talk about three aspects of what makes a group and things that we need to be paying attention to in what makes a group a group. The first thing is performance, right? How people perform tasks when they are in a group versus not in a group. We're also going to talk later about behavior and then decision making. But first, we're going to talk about ideas of performance. We've already seen this when we talked about norm triplet at the first experiment in social psychology. We were talking about how well people perform on a task based off of their groupiness, based off of whether or not they're in a group. So let's keep talking about this idea of performance. Who performs better? Someone who is alone or someone who is in a group? Okay, so if you remember the norm triplet study, that's the one where they did the fishing reel, right? And the boys were able to reel in the fishing reel faster. That was the task. So they were faster. That means they performed better at the task when they were in a group compared to when they were alone, right? That would indicate that when you're in a group, you perform better. So what happens when you perform a task either alone or in front of others? Well, if it's something simple like reeling in a reel, it tends to be that you will do better if you happen to be in a group. But if you realize, if you think about this, like, oh man, if I'm in a group, I actually do worse. How does that work? So you're thinking about, oh, I've got to go sing a solo in front of everybody, or I've got to, go perform on the sports, right? So I've got to be a linebacker and I don't do as well when people are watching me, that kind of stuff. You're like, wait a minute, but that means that I would actually do worse. So let's talk about social facilitation versus social inhibition. Social facilitation means that you do the task better when there are other people around. So the theory of social facilitation says that people perform tasks better when others are around. Social inhibition means that you actually do worse when there are other people around. So for example, we talked about norm triplet. That would be an example of social facilitation. Having other people around facilitated performance on the task. You compared that, so that was the norm triplet one. I should say 98, by the way, not 89. So cyclists competing directly against one another in the same track versus race alone against the clock. That was the original observation that he made. And then children reeling in the fishing lines, they did better when they were in a group compared to when they were alone. All right? Social facilitation is based on the idea that other people around makes you do better. There is a concept, and this is Bob Zients, we're going to talk about in just a little bit, that says that just having the presence of other people there is going to make you do better at the task. Understanding that the mere presence of other people is going to make you do better. We're not talking about them cheering you on. We're not talking about them giving you advice. We're just saying their presence makes you perform better. Okay? The mere presence would be enough for them to help you perform better at the task. We can even see this in animal behavior. And we're going to show this later on when we talk about Zient's study with cockroaches. So this brings up the question, is it better then for you to take your social psychology exam in a crowded classroom or by yourself? Well, that depends. Social facilitation says that other people in the classroom are going to make you do better. Social inhibition means that you're actually going to do worse. And Allport gives us the second step. So Norm Triplett was the first. Gordon Allport started to realize that he ran a study back in 1920 that said students who were refuting philosophical arguments in the presence of others actually performed worse when they're in the presence of others compared to when they were alone. That would indicate not social facilitation, but social inhibition. So what is the main thing that causes you to do better or worse when you're in the presence of somebody else? So this is an example of social inhibition. Drive theory is Bob Zient's theory about this. So Bob Zients, we remember we talked about him when we talked about emotions compared to Lazarus, but this is his social facilitation theory, and specifically drive theory explains both social facilitation as well as social inhibition. So it starts with the idea that the mere presence of somebody else being there causes a certain amount of arousal. Remember, your heart beating faster, that kind of arousal, okay? If you are aroused, that is going to increase your dominant response, how you would normally act. All right, so let's go back and let's talk about how this would work with social facilitation first, and then we'll talk about it with inhibition. So you see there the mere presence of others. What Bob Zients is saying is that just having somebody there, the mere presence of them, makes you be aroused, right? Even in something like an animal. He's got a famous study where cockroaches were given a maze. Now, it turns out that cockroaches are generally understood to not be particularly, intelligent animals, but the cockroaches were put in a maze, and they had to do the maze either alone or in the presence of other cockroaches. We're not talking just about humans. It's the mere presence even of whatever your species happens to be. And what he found was that they were able to perform the maze faster in the mere presence of other cockroaches. So what he's saying here is that turns out that animals like a cockroach, even the mere presence of other cockroaches, the member of their own species, causes this arousal. Well, their dominant response is to run faster, follow light, whatever cockroach's dominant response is. And it turns out that the mere presence of the other cockroaches was enough for them to actually perform better at that task. However, if the task is difficult or new, then that means your dominant response is not going to be one that is going to help you out. So here's how this goes. If the task is easy, one that you've done lots of times, for example, and your dominant response is going to be the correct response. So for example, let's say that you know how to tie your shoes. All right, that's an assumption. Your dominant response is you're going to tie your shoes correctly. So that means if that other people are around, then you're actually going to tie your shoes faster, more effectively. The presence of the other people causes arousal, which makes you perform your dominant response, which is to correctly tie your shoes. That equals social facilitation. It helps you. It enhances, it facilitates your performance. But let's say now that you were asked to, instead of tie your shoes, and this is the study in 1965 that Zients is talking about, instead of tying your shoes or doing a simple tying task, they gave you a jacket. In this case, it's kind of like a straight jacket kind of thing. You put it on, and you're asked to tie it on. Well, you've never done this before. This is a new jacket you've never seen before. It is a difficult task. Even though tying is the basic idea, this is a new task. Your dominant response is to not do it correctly because you've never done it before. And so having other people around actually made people perform worse on the task of tying this particular jacket together because the dominant response was not to do well. They'd never done it before. Having people around made them do worse. So what this means for you in your social psychology exam is that if this is easy for you, and your dominant response is to do well, then having other people around is going to help you. It's going to create social facilitation. If this is not easy for you, if it's hard, if it's difficult, if you don't do well in exams, that kind of a thing, then it might be that having other people around actually leads to social inhibition because the dominant response is to do worse instead of better. Okay, so this is the idea of the cockroaches. Turns out that they actually did a second version of this. The cockroaches did better on a very simple maze. Now, for cockroaches, this is like one turn, it's actually two turns, a right turn and a left turn. That was a simple maze. On a complicated maze, even the cockroaches did worse in the mere presence of other cockroaches. So drive theory is the mere presence of others causes you to perform better as long as it is as long as your dominant response is to perform better. If your dominant response is to perform worse, it's actually going to cause you to perform worse. In humans, they did the same kind of an idea with recreational pool players. So people who were good at pool, they weren't professionals, but they were good at pool. If others were around, they did better. If others weren't around, they did worse. But if people who really weren't very good pool players, like me, were in front of other people, it would cause arousal, which would create the dominant response to do poorly, and I would do even worse than I would if I were alone. Okay, so why? The cognitive sources of arousal have to do with the idea of evaluation apprehension. So why would you do worse? Where does the arousal come from in drive theory? That's what we're talking about. Well, the idea of being evaluated, that is a good one. So for example, if I'm playing pool and a lot of people are watching, I'm really concerned that they're going to say, oh man, this guy stinks. I have had people tell me that I'm really bad at pool, right? I am apprehensive of a negative evaluation. However, the distraction conflict theory would say that the distraction of having other people around would create a conflict of doing well, right? So the distraction conflict theory would say that the arousal comes from the idea of distraction, which conflicts with your drive. So when we answer this question, it depends on what your dominant response is going to be. All right, let's move on. We talked about performance. Now let's talk about something else. We need to talk about social loafing. There's a very famous study by Ringelmann in 1913. And what he did was he got people to pull on a rope. Think of like tug of war, okay? And he just connected it to something that measures the actual amount of force that you're pulling against when they pull the rope. When a group of men pulled on the rope, they actually did less pulling. They pulled less per person than when they did it by themselves. So all you do is you take, let's say you have me pull on the rope by myself, and you measure how much I pulled, how strong the force of the pull was, okay? Then you take me with 3 other guys, so there's 4 of us total. We all pull on the rope at the same time, and then you take the force that we pulled and divide by 4, and you'll find that we pull less individually when we are in another group. Latney, Williams, and Harkins found that the same thing happens in this case when people were asked to cheer loudly or to clap. What they did is they put them in separate booths, right, recording booths with earphones on, right, and they said, hey, clap and cheer as loud as you possibly can. They either had them do this by themselves or with other people. But what they did is they were able to record individually each person's output and how loud they clapped. And what they found is that people clapped and cheered a lot louder when they were by themselves compared to when they were in a group. All right. These are what we call additive tasks. The contribution of each member, they're combined into one single output. The noise of the cheer overall, the amount that we pulled together. That is an additive task. And what you tend to find is that when people do additive tasks in groups, they tend to perform worse. There's less individual effort, specifically on simple tasks. This is called social loafing. Social loafing. So social loafing says that specifically with additive tasks, when they're simple, people perform less. They put in less effort when they're in a group than they would if they were an individual. That is social loafing. You may have seen social loafing when you've done a group project. You'll say that people work a lot less on the group project than they would if they were doing it by themselves. That would be social loafing. However, studies have also found that people actually increase their performance in a group when the group task is difficult, when it's more complex. If there are lots of things that need to be done, they're actually more likely to perform when they're in a group than when they're by themselves. So if it's an easy task, people tend to loaf. They slack off. They do less when they're in a group compared to alone. However, when it's a complex task and it's clear that people need to be contributing, they actually will perform better. They'll perform more effort in a group than they would by themselves. Who slacks off the most? So tell me, what are some characteristics of somebody you think slacks off when they're in a group? Who does the most social loafing? Well, it turns out that men certainly do more than women, right? Women tend to be higher in relational interdependence. That means that they tend to care more about relationships in general, and they tend to work harder when they're in a group compared to what men do. Western cultures tend to be more individualistic. Eastern cultures tend to be more collectivistic. So, for example, Asian cultures tend to be more interdependent, more collectivistic in their worldview, and therefore they find it's more important to perform well as a group. Whereas in the United States, we often focus on individuals, and therefore we're less likely to perform in a big group if we can't show our individual effort or get individual recognition. Okay, so we talked about performance. Now we need to talk about behavior and decision making. So let's talk about ideas of behavior. So if you were invisible for 24 hours, what would you do? Well, this is a picture of University of Maryland students celebrating their school's first national championship in basketball. I don't know if that looks like a normal celebration. This is in the middle of the street, by the way. This is them burning a couch in the middle of the busiest street that runs by campus. It turns out that people behave differently in a group than they do when they're alone. So we need to talk about de-individuation and the idea of mob mentality. De-individuation is when your individual effort cannot be identified. You are not identifiable, de-individuated, right? You are not as much of an individual as a mob, a group, right? A mob is a form of a group. So people, when they're in big groups, they're more likely to do things that they would not do otherwise, specifically antisocial things in this case. Like, for example, set a couch on fire in the middle of the street. You're probably not going to do that when you are by yourself. However, if you're in a giant group and it's pretty hard for you to be individually identified as the one who burned the couch when everybody's burning the couch, you're less likely to have consequences for your actions. So when you have a reduced sense of self-identity, you're being de-individuated, okay? We're going to move on this one, actually. We're going to talk a little bit about Zimbardo's model of de-individuation. This is related to his ideas that are involved in the Stanford prison study. But what he's saying, think about this more in the ideas of mob mentality, though. So the antecedent conditions mean these are the things that the precursors, the basic stuff that's going on in the situation. If people are anonymous, if there's diffusion of responsibility, so it's not like one specific person is responsible for what's happening. If there's a lot of people around, it tends to have an energizing effect. Remember that idea of arousal with drive theory that was going on? And then stimulus overload. Turns out that when people are in big groups, it tends to be loud, tends to be a lot of stuff going on, a lot of people visually, auditorily, a lot of stuff, and that can be a stimulus overload. That seems to lead people internally to de-individuate, to feel less concerned about self-observation and self-evaluation, because everybody's doing a bunch of stuff, and so I'm not going to be judged individually. You're less concerned about what other people are going to think about you because everybody is there and everybody's doing this together. And that tends to also lead to ideas of weakened internal controls. So you're less worried about shame, guilt, fear, commitment, etc. And you tend to just act in a group, act like a mob. This leads behaviorally to impulsivity, irrationality, emotionality, and antisocial behavior. So just think about what happens when a bunch of people get together and they're all excited because they won the national championship. Suddenly people start breaking stuff, stealing stuff, burning stuff, when they would never do that on their own because they've become de-individuated. All right, so we talked about performance, we talked about behavior. Now we need to talk about ideas of decision making that change when you are in a group. So let's talk about groupthink. So Janus in 1972 came up with this idea of groupthink. It comes from the idea from observations in real life. So the Bay of Pigs is during the Cold War. There's a bay in Cuba where Soviet ships were coming with nuclear weapons, and we had to decide to what we were going to do. We as a country, meaning JFK, had to decide, right? This wasn't in 1972. The study was in 1972. Bay of Pigs was not in 1972. The conclusion of the United States Naval Command to ignore the warnings of an imminent Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor, right? So when Pearl Harbor was coming up, we actually were warned that there was an imminent attack, but Pearl Harbor wasn't ready. The launch of the Challenger space shuttle. So the launch of the Challenger space shuttle, Cuban Bay of Pigs, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis that I described. Bay of Pigs is actually when we invaded Cuba, we meaning United States-backed armed people actually invaded the Bay of Pigs, and it was stomped out really, really quickly, right? So I mixed those up, I apologize. The Challenger space shuttle happened when I was about 8 years old. It was the first space shuttle that exploded, right? So on takeoff, just a few seconds after takeoff, it exploded. It was particularly bad because there was a teacher on board, and they were going to do a lot of broadcasts from space to elementary school kids. So a lot of us elementary school kids were actually watching live when the space shuttle exploded in midair. So the idea here is that each one of these things had warnings, right? People were warned about what was happening, but they still came to a conclusion that they should go ahead with a disastrous decision. And Janus is saying that this is because of a thing called groupthink. Groupthink is when you have faulty decision making when you have a very cohesive group. Okay? This is often due to ideas of having a strong leader. So, for example, let's say that we've got a president of the United States who is very strong in his or her opinion about what should or shouldn't happen, and therefore says, I think we should do this, I think we should do this. And the group, because it's very cohesive, says, yeah, we agree because you're our leader and we agree. Well, it turns out that can lead to some bad decisions. The group is in charge of making it, but the strong leader can lead them away. Even though an individual member might not think they should do it, the group leader can lead them. So this is often because contrary information, a divergent opinion, for example, is ignored, right? It's important for us to be a cohesive group, so we don't want to say, leader, I think you're bad. I think you got a bad idea going on here, because we want to be seen as a good group member. If decisions are seen to not be able to be wrong, right? So if you have an infallible leader, for example, that can lead to bad decisions. The members have to agree to it. That can be good. The members all agree because they want cohesiveness. If all members have to agree, then they're going to be forced to agree together. Unanimity. Which groups are most at risk? The ones who are very cohesive, homogeneous, have a lot of norms, and have a charismatic or strong leader. Those are the ones who are more likely to make poor decisions. So, for example, with the Challenger explosion, there was actually a meeting of everybody who was involved, and the people who some engineers who created something called an O-ring said, hey, you know what, it's colder than it normally is in Florida when we're supposed to launch. We don't know how our ring is going to hold up, and if the ring doesn't hold up, then it could leak out the gas, which could make things explode. And the strong leaders said, hey, we got to go. We got to launch. We've been delaying the launch. People are waiting for the launch. Let's launch. Why don't we launch? Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure that we can't go? And they actually, they meant to be saying, all right, if you really feel like we can't go, then we can't go. But it was communicated essentially that, hey, we got to get this done. So unless you're absolutely sure, do you want to be the person who is going to stop us from going and waste thousands and millions of dollars of taxpayer money? That kind of thing. And they said, all right, I think we'll go ahead and go. Turned out to be a huge disaster. So instead of groupthink, you want to try and make sure that you have things like a devil's advocate. You want to make sure that the leader doesn't say what their opinion is at the outset, but instead hears everybody's opinions. You may not want everybody to have to agree if it can mean that other people can, give a divergent opinion. Sometimes you may want to have somebody be a devil's advocate where their specific role is that they must disagree so that you can get the best data possible in order to make a good decision. Another group decision-making problem that happens is called group polarization. Group polarization is that when people hang out, they tend to become more polarized in their opinion. So almost always we talk about this in terms of like politics. So if I'm a Republican and I hang out with a bunch of other Republicans, I'm probably going to end up being more extreme in my, more conservative in my views than if I just don't hang out with a bunch of Republicans, or if I hang out with a group of mixed group of people. So the tendency for group decision making to be more extreme than those made by individuals is the group polarization. Okay, if you got a group of Republicans working together, they're more likely to choose a more conservative view than if it's an individual Republican working by themselves. Why would this happen? Well, one is because of persuasive arguments. It turns out that if you're hanging out with a bunch of Republicans, you're probably only going to hear persuasive arguments in favor of Republicans. Very few people are going to actually give you a good Democratic, meaning Democrats, reason for something happening, right? They're going to give weak arguments for the other position, strong arguments for their position, which means that you're going to get better information about what you already believe. Social comparison is, if this group is important to you, then you're probably comparing yourself to somebody who is either a leader or somebody who espouses the ideals in an extreme way. And therefore you're saying, hey, oh boy, I might not be a good conservative because that person is more conservative than me. It can go in the opposite way. So if I'm a Democrat and I'm with a bunch of other Democrats, like, ooh, that person's a real liberal. I'm not a very good liberal. You're comparing yourself, and that might lead you to espouse more extreme points of view. Okay, that is good for now. Thanks, and we will talk to you later.